Okay, so when I was asked to give this talk tonight, I thought I would like to talk about compassion, which is a lovely topic. And we've all heard and read and meditated on this topic many times, but I think we can never do it enough. It's such a beautiful and precious topic. But then while thinking about the talk, I thought I would also like to talk about suffering, because the two are actually intertwined, suffering and compassion. Compassion is normally defined as the wish for an end to suffering for oneself or others. So we have to be willing to look at suffering, deal with suffering, if we want to have compassion. We have to be willing to get our hands dirty in a way. So some people might feel, oh, compassion, yeah, oh, that's really beautiful. I want to meditate on that. I want to have more of that. But then when it comes to suffering, oh no, I don't want to know about that. I don't want to deal with that. That's depressing. That's horrible. And this is understandable that we would feel that way. Suffering is an unpleasant topic. But it doesn't have to be. That's the good news. It's all a question of our mind, our attitude, how we deal with it. So that's the topic tonight, suffering and compassion. And let's take a few moments to check our motivation and try our best to have as positive a motivation as we can for being here, listening to, participating in this session. So those of you who are familiar with the idea of bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, the aspiration to become enlightened, awakened, a Buddha, to help all sentient beings. If you're familiar with that and you're comfortable with that, you can bring that into your mind. You can think, I'm here in order to create more causes for enlightenment, becoming a Buddha, so I can be of the greatest possible benefit to all living beings. And any of you who are not so familiar with that or comfortable with that as a motivation, you might think of something similar. I think we all, at least sometimes, feel this wish to be beneficial, to benefit others, to benefit the world. We'd like to see the world a better place. We'd like to see people more happy and not so unhappy. We'd like to be able to make a contribution towards that. So if you've had such a feeling like that before, see if you can remember it, bring it back up into your mind. And then you can connect that feeling with what we're doing here tonight, wishing that this session here tonight will be beneficial to me, to others, to the world, to bring about more peace and happiness, and to eliminate suffering, problems. Okay, so there's a sutra. It's in the Pali tradition. I don't know if it exists in the Tibetan or the Chinese tradition. It's called the Salata Sutra. And in this sutra, the Buddha gives an analogy of pain being like an arrow. He said, when we have pain, it's like being shot with an arrow. So that's painful. Having an arrow sticking in you is naturally painful. In the sutra, he mentions pain, But I think we could apply this to other kinds of problems as well. Not just physical pain, but there's so many other kinds of painful experiences. Mental pain, depression, feelings of loss, grief, relationship problems, problems with work, problems with just ourselves, unwanted thoughts, feelings, emotions, stuff happening in our mind that we don't really want. Okay, so I think we could apply this to any kind of problem, any kind of difficulty that we might experience in life. So it's painful, like having an arrow stuck in us. And then the Buddha said, the Buddha said that an ordinary person, someone who's not trained in the path, the practice, responds to pain by getting upset. And this can include feeling sad, feeling unhappy, also angry. We sometimes get angry, blame other people or blame oneself, feel guilty, feel shame. Oh, what a loser I am, what a failure. Why does this have to happen to me? So all kinds of reactions that are more on the mental level. These can come up in the mind. And then what can happen too is one tries to avoid this problem or escape from this problem through sensory pleasures. So there's all kinds of escape routes: drinking, eating, watching movies, watching TV, listening to music, sports, traveling. So many ways that we can try to escape from problems. But the Buddha said if we react in these ways, if we get upset about the problem and then try to run away from it into sensory pleasures, this is like shooting ourselves with a second arrow. It's just making things worse rather than better, right? Exacerbating the pain, the problems. And then he said, if a wise person experiences pain, he actually said a trained disciple, meaning, a disciple who's following the path, practicing. A wise person doesn't get upset and doesn't try to escape or run away from the problem, but just stays with the problem itself, the pain itself, the first arrow. So that person only has one arrow rather than two. And uses one's practice. You deal with this pain through your practice. He didn't really go into details on how to do that, but there's plenty of other material. For example, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Mindfulness itself, the practice of mindfulness itself, is one method that can be used to deal with the first arrow, the actual original pain or problem. And remembering impermanence, it's not permanent, it's not going to last, it's transitory, it comes and goes. So there's actually lots of different methods one can use to deal with the first arrow, the first original problem, and not elaborate or exacerbate the problem by shooting ourselves with a second arrow. And then eventually, by following the path, one will be able to become totally free from all pain, once and for all pain and its causes. So I think it's important that we look at our own mind and check how we deal, how we respond when a problem happens. So I'd like you to just close your eyes and remember a recent experience of some kind of problem that you had. It could be something physical pain, or another kind of physical problem, an injury, discomfort, hunger, thirst, cold. Or it could have been a problem in communication with another person, relationship with another person, or some kind of mental problem, like just feeling angry, feeling depressed, feeling bored or restless. Just something going on inside of you that's painful, problematic. So try to bring to mind one such experience you had, preferably something that happened recently, today, yesterday, in the last couple of days. And when you have brought this to mind, look at how you responded to this problem. For example, did you feel, oh no, I don't want this, I don't need this, why does this have to happen to me? Wanting to reject it, get rid of it, or run away from it. Did you feel bad, ashamed, guilty, blaming yourself? What a loser I am. How hopeless I am. Or did you get angry at somebody else or other people, blaming them for the problem? So if you did have any of those reactions, don't feel bad. Don't beat yourself up. It's normal. We've had such reactions millions or zillions of times before. So it's just habitual. The mind just keeps going down the same path. But see if you can stand back and look objectively at the way your mind reacted to this problem. And check to see if it was helpful to react that way, or did it just make things worse? And the good news is there are alternatives. There are other paths we can follow with our mind, other ways we can respond to problems that don't make things worse, that don't shoot ourselves with more arrows, and can even be helpful for our mind to grow, to develop along the path, to become more peaceful and happy. So we're going to be looking at some of these other ways of responding to problems. But I just wanted to share this because I've heard a saying that's going around these days: what you resist persists. Have you heard that one? And I was curious where that came from. And I Googled, and it's Carl Jung. Great psychotherapist. He actually said, what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. So that's kind of similar to what the Buddha said in this Salata Sutra. Carl Jung was mainly talking about the shadow, that part of our mind that contains all the unwanted things, the unacceptable things. You know, deep in our mind, we have all these kind of thoughts and feelings and emotions and stuff we don't like and we think are unacceptable. So we kind of bury them there. And I think it's true. In my experience, it's true that if we try to push that stuff away, avoid it, repress it, resist it, it doesn't go away. It just stays, and it could even get worse. Okay? So it's very important to learn other ways of dealing with this stuff. So as I mentioned, mindfulness is a very helpful method. Mindfulness in the sense of non-judgmental acceptance of whatever's there, whatever's happening in our mind moment by moment, not judging it, not judging ourselves for having this emotional stuff or this problem. And remembering that it's impermanent, it's not going to last. That's enormously helpful. Because otherwise we sometimes have this tendency to think, this is going to be there forever. Have you ever noticed that? Some problem comes up and it really feels like it's never going to go away. It's going to be there forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. It's crazy. It's not true. So just reminding ourselves of the impermanent nature of everything, including suffering, including pain, including problems. They are impermanent too. They don't last. They're going to go away. And this is another suggestion from Thich Nhat Hanh, going beyond just accepting and remembering impermanence. He says it's good to actually say hello to suffering. There's this lovely little book of Thich Nhat Hanh that was published a few years ago called No Mud, No Lotus. And it's all about transforming suffering, learning to accept and transform suffering. Have you seen that book? It's beautiful. So it's full of advice on how to have a more, and not just an accepting attitude, but even a friendly attitude towards suffering. So one of the things he recommends is this little, he calls it a gatha, like a little saying that you can use with your breathing. He says, breathing in, I know that I'm suffering. Breathing out, I say hello to my suffering. That's completely opposite to what we normally do, right? Normally we say, get lost, go away, I don't want you. We try to throw it out. So the idea of saying hello to suffering is pretty wow. But it's very interesting if you try it. He says that saying hello to suffering enables us to stop being afraid of pain and suffering and problems. Such fear is natural, but it does make us tense and tight. We tend to get more tense. And again, that just makes the situation worse. Probably increases the pain, physical and mental. And by the way, just to mention, if we're talking about physical pain, there's a very nice technique in a book called Mindfulness in Plain English by Bhante Gunaratana on dealing with pain, physical pain, which is similar to this. You just kind of focus on it, go right into it. Relax all the muscles around the pain. And then also relax your mental attitude. Stop avoiding it, resisting. Just go into it and look at it. And you can actually start seeing its movements. It's changing. It's not such a solid, concrete block of pain, but it's actually changing. And that method can be very helpful for dissolving pain. And he says you can use it with physical pain. You can also use it with emotional problems. So I can recommend that if any of you are interested. And Thich Nhat Hanh says that having this attitude of, saying hello to suffering also helps us to generate more qualities of the path, such as wisdom, understanding the nature of things, and compassion for others who have suffering, and then have the energy to try to heal them and help them to be more happy. One thing I find really helpful too in dealing with pain, whether it's physical or mental or whatever, is to remember the nature of the mind, how the mind is clear, knowing, also impermanent. Because sometimes I'll have these really troubling, unpleasant thoughts and emotions and images in my mind, and it's like I recoil from them. But if I just say to myself, this is just the mind, this is just in my mind. The mind is not a physical thing, not no matter there, nothing that can really hurt me. So what's happening is just an appearance in the mind, like a dream at night. It's like a daytime nightmare, a daymare. And just with it, like a nightmare, when we wake up and realize it's a nightmare, then we don't worry about it anymore. We just let it go. So it's similar with disturbing, unpleasant thoughts and emotions that happen during the day. They're just in the mind. They're not permanent. They're transitory. They're not me. They're just like clouds in the sky. So that's a really helpful thing. And then another, there's a poem by a Sufi master who lived in the 13th century. His name is Rumi. The poem is called The Guest House, and he has a similar idea there. He says, this being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. That's just a part of the poem, but it's a really beautiful poem. You can find it on the internet. Again, the idea is don't have aversion, resistance to the things that are coming up in your mind or in your life. Instead, have an attitude of welcoming. Just like a person running a guest house. This is just a guest. So I'm going to say hello and welcome. It's difficult to do this, of course, but not impossible. And it's certainly better than resisting it, which again just makes things worse. Then in our tradition, the Indo-Tibetan tradition, there's even the idea that suffering can be useful, beneficial. So you've probably come across this verse before from Shantideva, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where he points out good qualities of suffering. So in this verse he mentions 4 benefits. He says, suffering has good qualities. Through being disheartened with it, arrogance is dispelled. Any idea how that works? How is it that by experiencing suffering, our arrogance is dispelled?
For me, when I get arrogant, I just simply think that I've got everything figured out and things are going to go my way. So disheartening is when reality bites, and it's kind of a humbling experience. So it lessens my pride in knowing that I have a whole lot less control over the outcome of my day than I think. So I think it gives me a little bit more of a softer, open heart and a little bit more willingness to go with the flow than charge ahead and run over everything.
Yeah, because when we're arrogant, we can be kind of condescending, looking down on others. Oh, poor them, they're not as smart as me, they're not as great as me, so it's not a very wholesome state of mind. And that can happen when everything's going well. If there are times in our life when we're not experiencing any problems, things are going well, we feel like we're on top of the world. So then it's easy to become arrogant and then have those faults of arrogance. So when we have a problem happens in our life. It's sort of like our balloon gets pricked, all the air goes out. Humility is a much more wholesome state of mind to have. So problems and difficulties can help us be more humble and less arrogant. And then number 2 is compassion arises for those in cyclic existence. Okay, so this is what I'm going to mainly focus on in the talk, how we can have more compassion through suffering, through difficulties. And then he mentions the last line, negativities are shunned and joy is found in virtue. So this connects with karma. If we accept karma, we understand karma and believe in karma, then we can think, oh, well, this problem is happening to me for a reason, as Venerable Tsepel gave us a lovely talk about just before lunch today. The problem is due to karma that I created under the influence of afflictive emotions and ignorance, self-grasping ignorance. So if I don't want any more problems like this happening in the future, I have to stop creating negative karma and create good karma, virtue, because that's what leads to happiness. So we have more energy, more enthusiasm to live our life according to karma, creating virtue, avoiding non-virtue. So you've probably heard it. They say that bodhisattvas, someone who's really following the path to enlightenment, they actually feel joyful. They feel delighted when they encounter suffering. The same kind of joy that we feel when we get ice cream to eat. Hard to imagine, isn't it? But I think it's because they really do understand. They're totally convinced that there are benefits in experiencing problems. They know how to use difficulties and problems in the path. So of course we have also this whole tradition of lojong, or thought transformation, in which one section of that is how to transform suffering into the path. So there's all these different methods, different tools that we can use to not just accept suffering and be mindful about suffering, but actually use suffering and problems and pain as part of our path. That means we progress on the path, get closer to enlightenment, increase our knowledge, our wisdom, other qualities we need to get closer to enlightenment. So I think once you have experience of that, you're convinced that, oh, suffering is great, suffering is a good thing, this will help me get closer to enlightenment. I'm not there yet, I'm not at that point, but I can imagine, at some point in time, you stop hating suffering and you're able to welcome it with genuine joy. Hard to believe, isn't it? Okay, so I'm going to focus mainly on how suffering and problems can help us with compassion, to have more compassion. So we'll first look at compassion itself. So it's usually defined as the wish for oneself and others to not suffer. Although in the traditional teachings, they don't mention oneself. You've probably noticed. They only mention others, wishing others, other sentient beings to not suffer. But I think that oneself is implied because, if we don't have compassion for ourselves, and instead if we hate ourselves, we have aversion and hatred and, all kinds of negative feelings towards ourselves, then we can't really have compassion for others. So you probably heard this story about how the Dalai Lama was so amazed when he heard about Western people who hate themselves. Couldn't believe that was possible. But now he knows that that's the case. And when he teaches, especially in the West, he says how important it is to have compassion for yourself. If you don't have compassion, kindness for yourself, you won't be able to have it for others. So I think there's no doubt that we do need to have compassion for ourselves as well as for others. And in more contemporary settings, there's lots of different explanations of what compassion is. But here's one from Thupten Jinpa's book, which is called A Fearless Heart. Thupten Jinpa is, he was a translator, and still sometimes he translates for His Holiness. He's also a scholar, Tibetan philosophy as well as Western philosophy. And he was involved in developing a compassion training program for Stanford University, which has really taken off and become very, very popular. So this book, A Fearless Heart, he's telling the story of how this compassion training program came about and its main elements. He also tells his own story in there, which is very sweet. So in that book, the definition of compassion is a sense of concern that arises when we are confronted with another's suffering and feel motivated to see that suffering relieved. I think that's a very nice explanation of compassion. And I lived in Europe for a number of years and sometimes teaching there. And I came across the idea that for some people, compassion doesn't have a very nice connotation. I heard this when I was in Italy. They have the same word. France, Italy, Spain, they also use the word compassion. And I heard that in Italy, some people don't want to have compassion because the etymology of this word means to suffer with. Come means with. Passion can have the sense of suffer, like the Passion of Christ they talk about in Catholicism. So some people think if you have compassion for others who are suffering, you have to suffer too. You have to suffer along with them, and they don't want to do that. So some people don't want to have compassion. So that made me curious about the terms for compassion in like the Asian languages that we normally use for Buddhism, on what they mean. So I did a little exploration. Karuna is the Sanskrit term. I don't know Sanskrit, but I came across this explanation, which I thought was very nice. A quivering of the heart in response to a person's pain, a being's pain. So that doesn't have any kind of connotation that you have to suffer with the person who's suffering. Just that your heart is moved, your heart is touched. Which, I mean, that's how I feel. When I feel compassion, you know, something happening here in the heart chakra. Okay? And then the Tibetan term, I mean, I'm not a Tibetan scholar, but the Tibetan term is Ningje. Ning is the honorific term for heart or mind. It's the same, heart, mind. And then Jay has the sense of noble or venerable, kind of exalted. So we could say it means like a noble heart, noble mind. So again, it doesn't have the sense of you have to suffer to have compassion. How about the Chinese term? What's the Chinese term? And what does it mean, I guess is what I mean.
A feeling that you would like to deliver someone suffering.
Just to free them from suffering.
Yeah, free them from suffering.
But doesn't have the sense, does it have the sense that you must suffer too?
No, the sense of sorrow, no.
No, okay. And this is words of the Dalai Lama on compassion. And I actually got this from one of the books that Venerable Children has been working on. And this came in the context of a description of the delusions or the afflictive emotions, anger and so forth, which are, one of the common characteristics is they are said to disturb the mind. Yeah, anger, greed, jealousy, they disturb the mind in a kind of negative way. So the Dalai Lama was talking about how compassion also has a similar effect. It does disturb our mind. Our mind does get disturbed a little bit. but it's different from the delusions or the afflictive emotions. There's a genuine compassion as opposed to pity or personal distress when seeing others suffer. Is deliberately cultivated for a good purpose. Unable to ignore sentient beings' dukkha, suffering, compassion wishes them to be free of it. Our minds may be temporarily disturbed because our apathy has been challenged, but this type of mental disturbance spurs us to be more tolerant and kind. It makes our minds strong and determined to aid others and brings benefit to ourselves and others. So there is some disturbance in the sense of, you're not apathetic, cold, indifferent, but it's a positive kind of disturbance because somebody's suffering and they want to be free of suffering, and you are touched by that, and you also want them to be free of suffering. So you want to do whatever you can to relieve their suffering. So it's a beautiful thing, a positive thing. And ideally, compassion gives us energy and courage to do something. And of course, there's all kinds of examples of people doing amazing things in order to help others to be free of suffering, risking their own lives, like rescue workers and so on. And I don't know if you heard about this, but a few months ago, there was this guy in France. A little child, a 4-year-old child, was somehow dangling from a 4th floor balcony, was hanging there like that. And this man he was originally from Africa. He was trying to become an immigrant in France. He saw that, and he said without thinking, he didn't even think, he just ran. And within less than a minute, he climbed up to this 4th floor apartment, grabbed this little child, and brought him to safety. So this is an act of kindness, an act of compassion. You see someone, especially a little child, in trouble, in danger, and you automatically have energy. So if we just get overwhelmed by emotion and sadness and the poor little child, how terrible that is, and get stuck in that, we will not act to do what can be done to save them. Okay, so again from Thupten Jinpa's book, A Fearless Heart. He says, there are 4 things that happen when compassion arises, and these happen almost simultaneously, really, really fast. So this can help us recognize compassion in ourselves. The first thing is awareness of suffering or need. This is cognitive. Okay, so you see that person and recognize they're in trouble, they're in pain, they're sad, they're suffering. Second is sympathetic concern. This is emotional, so this is probably where we feel our heart moved, touched, activated, out of our apathy, as His Holiness says. You don't have to worry about writing all this down. I can send you the slide. And third is the wish that suffering will end. This is an intention. Okay, I want something to happen here. I want this suffering to stop. Fourth is the readiness to help it end, motivational. So by this time we're already moving, I mean, it's not always possible. For example, if you're watching television and you're seeing, refugees, or animals that are suffering, they're far away. They're on the other side of the world. So, I mean, you may not be able to just get up and rescue them, but we can still feel the compassion, feel the wish for them to be free of suffering. And there are things we can do on other levels. For example, sending a donation or doing a spiritual practice like tonglen. So even if we're not able to physically get up and act to relieve the suffering, there are still things we can do on other levels. So this this feeling of compassion probably comes up most easily and naturally with little beings like children or little kittens, little puppies, the birds. They just seem so much more vulnerable and helpless. And so whenever we see one of them in pain or sad or whatever, that's I think immediately these four things will happen: awareness of suffering, concern, wishing it to end, wanting to do something if we can. Sometimes it's a little harder with adults. I don't know about you, but when the person is grown up and big and they look as though they're able to take care of themselves, we may not be so likely to feel compassion. But it's a question of practice and training. And compassion is something we all have. It's a natural quality that everybody has, I think. I mean, this is what Buddhism says, and I think it's true. But some people have it more than others, but we all have the ability to work on our compassion, increase our compassion, have it more often, more of the time, and for more people and more beings. It does take effort. It's not going to just happen naturally. We can't just sit and wait, hope, pray to have more compassion. We have to put some energy into it. But if we understand the benefits of compassion, then we probably will want to have more of it. And again, the benefits I'm mentioning here come from Thupten Jinpa's book, A Fearless Heart. And these benefits are supported by scientific research. They've done lots of studies and found that these benefits are all things that we get. They say we are the first recipient of the benefit of compassion. It may not benefit others. I mean, of course, that's the idea, is to benefit others, but that may not always happen. But we benefit from having compassion. So one is the helper's high. So there's hormones, endorphins, I don't know what they're called, these different kinds of chemicals released in our body when we are helping others or even feeling concern, kindness, the wish to help others. So we ourselves will feel better with compassion. Also, this was interesting, research shows that those who have more compassion are able to benefit more from the acts of kindness done by others. So when others are kind to us, we'll be able to get more benefit from that if we ourselves are compassionate. I don't know quite how that works, but that's interesting. Maybe because our mind is just more open, our heart is open. So when others are kind to us, we're able to receive that. Take it in, yeah. Another one is being less lonely and more connected with others. There's a huge problem these days with loneliness. They do research and they find that a large number of people have only one person to talk to. Some have no one to talk to. Like if their spouse, their closest friend has passed away, they have nobody else to talk to, nobody else to connect with. And also it's been found loneliness is a cause of health problems and an early death. So your life is actually shortened if you're lonely. So compassion helps us to be less lonely because naturally it connects us more with others. Then we can benefit more from our relationships with others. Also, it gives us a sense of usefulness. This is another big problem. Some people, have a sense of my life is useless, life is meaningless, what's the purpose of life? And that's a very kind of depressive state of mind to have. So when we are helping others, or even just feeling compassion for others, if we're not always able to act it out, it gives us a sense of purpose in life. Also found that it helps to have less stress, because stress can often arise because of self-concern, being obsessed about oneself and one's problems. That leads to stress. So being more focused on others, their problems, helping them, takes away that source of stress. They also find research shows that kindness is contagious. When somebody does an act of kindness, other people who observe it or hear about it will be inspired to also do acts of kindness. And then if you think about it, and then those people do acts of kindness, other people see them and hear about them, and then they will be inspired. So it has this ripple effect. Maybe one act of kindness can lead to 100 or 1,000, who knows? And that means more people will benefit from the acts of kindness, and more people will benefit from doing the acts of kindness. And in short, we'll be happier and healthier. So, this may sound strange because it's all about what you yourself get. And we may think, but compassion is about others, being aware of others' needs and doing what will benefit them. But it's also helpful to realize we will get a lot from it that will motivate us to be more kind. And sometimes the Dalai Lama says, whenever he meets people, he always smiles and is friendly with them. And he says, most of the time, the people will smile back, but not always. Sometimes people look grumpy or suspicious or whatever. They don't respond in the same way. He says, well, never mind. At least I benefit. My being kind and friendly to them makes me feel good. If it doesn't make them feel good, well, I can't avoid that. But we benefit from our acts of kindness and compassion. Unfortunately, there are obstacles to compassion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but just point out a few. So there's this whole family of states of mind that are totally opposite to compassion. Cruelty, anger, hatred, harmfulness. Okay, so those kinds of things might arise in us sometimes, but they're not permanent. They aren't who we are. They're temporary, they're transitory, and there's lots of antidotes to them. And then pity. This is actually interesting because if you look up compassion in the dictionary, sometimes it gives pity as a synonym. But you noticed in that quote, the Dalai Lama distinguishes compassion and pity. And this is a statement from Stephen Levine, who's passed away now, but he did a lot of work with dying people. He made this distinction between pity and compassion. He says, when our fear touches another person's suffering, that is pity. When our love touches another person's suffering, that is compassion. So pity is more fear-based. We see somebody suffering, but we're afraid, and we don't want to get too close. We might get it too. Yeah, we want to protect ourselves from that suffering. So we may keep a distance, we may be somewhat condescending, looking down, oh, you poor thing. That's not real compassion. Compassion is love-based. When we really have love, we really care about this person. And also there's a sense of equality. Not I'm above looking down, but this is another human being, another living being, another sentient being just like me. We all suffer. We all have problems. We can empathize with that person's suffering. We want to get close, get involved, and do what we can to help them. So there's more love rather than fear involved. Self-centeredness. This is another obstacle to compassion. If we're too much obsessed with me, my problems, my needs, then we don't have much space in our mind to think of others and how we can help them. And I'm sure with Venerable children you have plenty of advice on how to overcome self-centeredness. But in my own experience, there's a couple of other things that can be an obstacle. One is denial. Denial is, like, I don't want to know, I don't want to hear, I don't want to get close, just trying to avoid it. That's a bit like in the Salata Sutra, I want to run away, escape in food and music and movies and whatever. Denial of suffering. And the kind of opposite to denial is when we do open up to suffering, but then we get overwhelmed by it. Like there's just so much of it. And it may seem hopeless. How can we ever end all this suffering? There's 7 billion human beings on this planet. They all got problems. And then all the other beings as well, the animals, the insects, all the beings in other, it's just so much. So we may feel kind of like we're drowning in all the suffering. And this can lead to what's called compassion fatigue, which apparently is a big problem, I've heard, especially among healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, psychologists, or people who, firemen or rescue workers and so on, who are actually dealing with real cases of suffering. They sometimes get to the point where they shut down, they can't deal with it anymore. They call it compassion fatigue. So I think there's a lot of tools in Buddhism that can help us to avoid compassion fatigue. So I think regarding these last 2 points, denial and despair, they're kind of like two extremes. Denial is, I don't want to know. Despair is, I do want to know, but then we don't know how to manage it. We get overwhelmed by it. So I think it's ideal to find a middle way between these two. A middle way in the sense of being open to, willing to face the reality of suffering, willing to deal with it, which we do have to if we want to have compassion. We have to get involved with suffering. But we don't want to go to the extreme of being overwhelmed by it, burned out by it. Compassion fatigue. So some Buddhist ideas that can help us with that is, first of all, just understand that suffering is part of life. The first noble truth. Everybody has suffering. It's just inevitable. And it doesn't help to deny it. It's not going to go away just because we don't look at it and pretend it's not there. It's there, and it's part of life. Everyone has it, not just me. But the good news is it's impermanent. Not going to be there forever. All suffering will come to an end one day. This is the very positive, optimistic side of Buddhism, the cessation of suffering. There's an end of suffering. There's a path leading to the end of suffering. So getting more familiar with those two ideas. Suffering exists, but it's impermanent, and there are remedies, there are solutions to end suffering. So that can help us have more courage, more willingness to face the reality of suffering, but not get overwhelmed by it. And then it's also helpful to understand suffering isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be beneficial, like that quotation from Shantideva that I mentioned earlier, the good qualities of suffering. But I think aside from that, you may have met people or people who've been through some kind of difficult experience and found it beneficial. For example, one person that I know told me that when he was in his 20s, he got cancer. And he said, I was kind of shocked. Wow, I thought that's really young to have cancer. But he said, but it was the best thing that happened to me in my life. So I said, why? And he said 2 good things came out of it. One was, while he was going through the treatment and recovery and so on, he had to stay with his family and rely on his family. And prior to that, he wasn't on good terms with his family. He had these conflicts with his family. So during the time when he was staying with them and recovering from cancer, they managed to work out their problems, their conflicts. So they came to a really good, harmonious relationship. So that was one beneficial thing. And the other beneficial thing was that he got interested in spiritual teachings, meditation. Started meditating and got more involved in Buddhism, and then eventually became a monk. And he's actually attending Sera Monastery in south of India. He's been there for quite a few years, and I saw him a couple of years ago, and he looks so happy. He's just so happy, doing so well, really studying and practicing. So maybe if he hadn't had the cancer, who knows? Actually, before that, he told me he'd been working on a fishing boat, which wasn't such a wonderful occupation. So his life really turned around as a result of that. So you probably heard similar stories of people who go through difficulties and learn from it and grow from it. And then it's also good just to have a practical attitude. Do what we can to help, try to relieve the suffering, but also accept what we can't. So again, there's this wonderful verse in Shantideva's text. Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy about something if it can't be remedied? You know that one? That's so practical, so helpful. So if there's some kind of problem, whether it's your own problem or somebody else's problem, it's just so useful to look at what can be done. What can be done? Is there a remedy? Is there a solution? Is there something I can do? And if there is, do it. But in some cases, there may be nothing that can be done. And then being unhappy is just shooting yourself with more arrows, right? Just making things worse. So better to accept. Accept what you can. And it's similar to that verse, or they call it the Serenity Prayer in Alcoholics Anonymous. I really like that one too. About, praying, asking for help to have the courage to change what can be changed, serenity to accept what can't be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's really, really helpful to keep that in mind and use that. Also, recently I came across an article on compassion on the Greater Good Science Center website, written by a doctor, Leif Haas, something like that. And he spoke about how difficult it is, in that kind of environment to maintain your compassion and dealing with all the different sufferings of your patients. And he mentioned a couple of things that he learned that were really helpful. One is detachment from outcomes. And this is really something that helps avoid compassion fatigue. So my understanding is if you have a fixed idea about what kind of outcome you want for your patient, I want this patient to be cured, or I want him to stop smoking. He mentioned the example of one patient who was continuously coming in with respiratory problems. He had emphysema, but he wouldn't stop smoking. So he got so frustrated with this guy. And so his fixed idea was he wanted this guy to stop smoking. And he got really frustrated that he wasn't. And that makes sense. But then he took time to talk to the guy and found out that he was just really stressed. He had a lot of problems in his life, and he just couldn't stop smoking because smoking gave him some relief from all the stress and problems of his life. So that really helped him change his mind and have compassion instead of anger and frustration. So that's an example. If you have a fixed idea of what is the outcome you want, you're attached to that, and then if that doesn't happen, then you get frustrated, and that can lead to compassion burnout, compassion fatigue. So he said, research on burnout and resilience among caregivers in the face of suffering demonstrates that detachment is associated with less distress. Detachment here meaning not being attached to an outcome, specific outcome. The presence of mind to understand our own emotions in the face of much suffering is key to creating some detachment. So it's also helpful to have mindfulness and just be aware of what's going on in your mind and how your mind is being affected by your own emotions, anger, fear, or attachment to certain outcomes. So I think it's important that we accept our limitations. So it's like you have to have a balance. You have to have the compassion and be involved and do what you can to relieve suffering, but also accept that, we're not God, we're not Buddha. We can't really make things happen the way we would want them to. Okay? We have limitations. So we do what we can, but we may not be able to fix the problem or make it the way we want it to be. Does that make sense? So that's another thing that's really helpful. And another thing this doctor mentioned was slowing down. He says, if you're too speedy, then you get into this stress mode, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight mode, and that's not very helpful. So it's much better to try to slow down and be in the parasympathetic mode, the parasympathetic nervous system. He says if we don't slow down, if we don't quiet our minds, look and listen, we miss the opportunity to really see what our patients are going through. So he said he's learned that before meeting a patient, he will calm down, take just a few minutes to calm down, watch his breath, and then when he meets the patient, try to really pay attention, not just to their physical system, but also their emotions as well. And then this is a Buddhist idea. Everyone is responsible for their own suffering and their own happiness. So we can only do the best we can, but it's not realistic to expect that we are totally responsible for other people's happiness, that we can actually make them happy and take away their suffering. Sometimes we may put such expectations on ourselves, and then if it doesn't happen, then we can become depressed, feel guilty, feel bad. So we have to, again, accept our limitations. Because even the Buddha cannot, there's this famous quotation from the Buddha where he said, the Buddhas do not wash away negativities with water. They do not clear away suffering with their hands. They don't transfer their knowledge to others. They liberate by teaching the truth of reality. Okay, so even a Buddha isn't able to remove another person's suffering. So is it realistic to expect that we can do that? And then, of course, emptiness. Not easy to understand emptiness, but getting more of an understanding of emptiness really helps in seeing suffering in a more realistic way. I'll share this story that I heard. His Holiness Sakya Trizin, who's the head of the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, was once asked, how is it possible for Bodhisattva to open up and be aware of all the suffering of all sentient beings and not become completely depressed? And he gave a lovely answer. He gave the analogy of a person who's asleep and having a nightmare. He says, if your friend is lying there on the bed or the couch and they're asleep, and you can tell they're having a nightmare because they're sort of tossing and turning and maybe crying out and obviously looking very frightened and disturbed. So you want to help your friend. What do? You wake him up or her up and assure them it's only a dream. It's not real. And when doing this, you're aware that your friend is suffering, but you yourself don't suffer. Because you know it's not real, it's not true, what they're experiencing. So he said in a similar way, the bodhisattvas look at all the sentient beings in the universe and all the suffering they're experiencing. And because they have wisdom, understanding emptiness, nothing is as real and solid and concrete as it appears to be. Because they have that perspective, they know that all this suffering isn't real as it appears. Relatively, conventionally, yes, it is there. But ultimately, it's not there. It's empty of existing in a real, independent, objective way. So that perspective enables them to deal with the suffering, help sentient beings, but without themselves becoming overwhelmed by or depressed or in despair about suffering. And their job is waking everybody up. Hey, wake up. Realize the true nature of things. And that's the way to be free of suffering. So I really like that story. I found that really helpful. Having this balance, compassion and wisdom, like the two wings of the bird. We can't reach enlightenment with only compassion or only wisdom. We need both to be able to ascend in a balanced way to enlightenment. Then there's also tonglen. Tonglen is a really helpful practice. And I thought I didn't want to just spend all the time talking. Let's do a little bit of tonglen practice. And I want to teach you and guide you through a kind of simple way of doing tonglen. There's many ways of doing tonglen. Some very complicated, some are more simple. But this one I came across some years ago. I don't even remember where, but I find it really helpful. And it's a tonglen practice you use with your own problem, some problem you yourself are experiencing. So you can do it in a couple of minutes. Once you know how to do it, you can do it in a few minutes. And you also don't even have to be meditating. You can be doing it while you're out and about in your daily life. It's good to calm your mind, generate love and compassion. Then focus on the problem. Remind yourself you're not alone. You're not the only person in the world who has a problem like this. Many others do as well. Then you use that to generate compassion. How nice, how wonderful it would be if everyone else could be free of this problem. And then you decide to accept this problem instead of resisting it, wanting it to go away, pushing it away, hating it. You accept it, you take it on, wishing that by doing that, all those other people, all those other beings will be free of their suffering, their problem. Then if you have time, you can do the giving part. Imagine sending good energy, happiness to all other beings. So let's try it out. Make yourselves comfortable, but try to sit with your back straight if you can. Let your shoulders relax. Let all the parts of your body relax as much as possible. If there is any tension anywhere in your body, imagine it melting and draining out of you, sinking into the earth below. Now let's bring into our mind, our heart, feelings of love and compassion. We can do that by just contemplating. I want to be happy and to not suffer. And the same is true for everyone else. Every person, every being is just like me. They all just want to be happy and do not want to suffer. Now bring to mind some problem or difficulty that you may be experiencing at present. You could think of the same one you thought of at the beginning of the class tonight, or another one as you like. It could be something physical or mental or both. And now contemplate that you're not the only person in the world who has a problem like this. There are many others, many other people, maybe also other kinds of beings who have a similar problem to yours. And even those who don't have that kind of problem, the kind of problem you have, they have other kinds of problems. So there's nobody, no ordinary being, who doesn't have some kind of problem, some kind of difficulty, pain, suffering. See if that can give you a sense of compassion. Just as you wish to be free of your suffering, all those other people and beings also wish to be free of their suffering. How nice that would be, how good it would be if we could all be free of our problems. And now, see if you can take the attitude of accepting your problem instead of hating it, resisting it, wishing it to go away. Turn that attitude around and accept it. Decide that you will willingly take it on, experience it, bear it. And by doing that, may all other people and beings be free of their suffering, their problems. So you can say to yourself, by my experiencing this problem, may all other people and beings be free of their problems and the causes of the problems. Then think of all the good things you have in your life, your good karma, your good qualities, your health, your resources. Well, you have a lot going for you. We all do. As human beings with a precious human life, we have a lot of good in our lives. Feel how nice it would be if we could share this with others, and it could be the cause for them to have whatever they need to be happy and peaceful, fulfilled, satisfied. And if you want, you can imagine light or energy going out from your heart to others, all other beings everywhere in the universe, becoming whatever they need to be peaceful and happy and satisfied. Okay, so you can open your eyes. And do we need to stop now at 7:30, or we go on a little bit? I just wanted to give a chance for questions if anyone has a question you'd like to ask.
There was a question that came up in these benefits of compassion, which are really lovely. But one of the things that came to mind when I was looking at the helper high and anyway, we feel better, is also the edge of the enemy in the mind that is helping in order to fulfill our own needs. And, how to discern in your own mind. I mean, the helper high is very nice, but the helper high can also become the motivation.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just a point of view that needs exploration, but it was a question that came up for me.
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is what His Holiness often says, if you're going to be selfish, be wisely selfish. Meaning, be kind and compassionate and help others. That is the best way for you to fulfill your needs and your wishes. You will be happier, and they will benefit as well, by the way. So even if your main motivation is feeling good yourself, others will benefit. That's one thing that comes to mind. And also, in the book, Thupten Jinpa's book, A Fearless Heart, it's been a while since I've read it, but he has a whole section on self-compassion, and I don't know if this is related, but anyway, he says sometimes people are concerned about the whole idea of self-compassion because it can sound like self-indulgence, pampering yourself, it's all about me. But he says, actually, the research shows that people who are self-compassionate, people who are, really kind to themselves, taking care of themselves, are actually very compassionate to others. They're out there doing things for others and helping others. And on the other hand, people who tend to have the opposite of, beating themselves up, hating themselves, and so on, they tend to be really depressed and then withdrawn, and they're not so much out there and helping others. So I don't know if this is actually related to what you're asking, but I think the point is, if we experience benefit, we are happier, we feel better, we're flourishing because we're helping others, then that will actually inspire us to help others even more. And I mean, that's just talking in a secular way, not necessarily people following the path. But those of us who are following the path, if we really are listening to teachings and meditating on teachings and so on and so forth, seriously trying to study and practice, then we're constantly being reminded of the dangers of being self-centered and working on that. And of course, the ultimate antidote to self-centeredness is emptiness, realizing emptiness. When you realize there is no, solid, permanent, real I anyway to be attached to. So once that is out of the way, then the self-centeredness will be out of the way as well. Although that's not completely true, because arhats, those following the path to nirvana, they don't have a sense of self. They're free of self-grasping ignorance, but they still aren't fully dedicated to helping others in the best possible way. But anyway, if we're in the Mahayana, studying and practicing that path, and I think the reminders are always there of the importance of overcoming that. Does that help? That makes sense? Yeah. And I think it's just a question of watching our own mind and our motivation. Am I doing this just to feel good myself? I mean, my feeling is that's not really that satisfying. I'm doing it just so I feel good, I think naturally there'll be a sense that that's not really the best motivation to have. I really want to be more concerned for others and do it for their benefit, not for what I get out of it. So I think just our natural sense of what's wholesome and what's not wholesome will carry us in that direction. I hope so, unless somebody's totally narcissistic and yeah.
There's so many ways to look at these different verses and understand them. that the one that you read about benefiting the benefits of compassion in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. I remember Geshe Tashi saying there were 5 benefits, and that first line, through being disheartened with it meaning cyclic existence.
Okay.
And then arrogance is dispelled. That's a second one. So it's just another way of looking at.
Yeah, I also, when I was working on this today, I seem to recall, actually, I thought there were 5. I forgot what the 5th one was, so thanks for reminding. Being disheartened with cyclic existence, yes. So that is a benefit of suffering, having more renunciation, more determination to be free from cyclic existence. Yeah. 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 Thanks for reminding.
I wanted to appreciate this line that you gave by Stephen Levine about pity, fear. When our fear touches another suffering, that's pity. When our love touches another suffering, that's compassion. And I was thinking when you were saying that, and I want to think about this more, that two other things that I've worked with. One is that Mother Teresa said, people don't need our pity, they need our understanding. And Thich Nhat Hanh always says that when you want to love a person, you can't really love them unless you understand them. So I was trying to see this connection there, like what is going on for people when they have pity. I'd always related it to maybe arrogance more. But going into the thing about fear, I think, is quite insightful. Somewhere in there, I think I like the idea of looking at understanding as well. That seems like if you could understand things in a useful, like compassion that has wisdom rather than stupid compassion. So a certain kind of understanding seems quite beneficial.
Mm. Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about that too in his book, No Mud, No Lotus, about understanding, looking deeply into suffering and understanding what it's all about, understanding its causes and so forth. And in that way, I mean, that's the way to be free, really. Not running away from suffering because it's too unpleasant, I don't want to look at it, but going really deeply into it and understanding it. And that's the actual way to free ourselves from suffering and also help others be free of suffering. The wisdom.
That note, I'm thinking of like, well, I'm just bringing it to the present tense, and people I know who have difficulty with being in touch with fear. Like I noticed this I'm talking about my mom actually. I noticed that like some of these things around problems in the world or climate change and a lot of these things, I've noticed in her over the years that she actually has fear about these things, but she doesn't know how to sit with the fear. And I think this is why maybe a lot of the political climate is how it is in a certain way, because it's easy to go to people's anger. You know, like if you are inundating yourself with Fox News, like my mom and many people in this country do right now, then you feel more powerful because you have anger on board. And you actually can't, if you don't know how to touch into fear and work with it and understand it, like in the way Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about all these different things that we have to be able to look at, then you get kind of stuck. It seems. I witnessed that.
Yeah. I heard something from a therapist that I thought was quite profound. She said the worst feeling to have is helplessness or powerlessness, which is also related to fear. And anger comes up as a kind of cover, you know, it makes us feel powerful, but we're not really dealing with that underlying powerlessness. And yeah, so I found that really helpful to understand in my own self, but also if you can deal with that in yourself, see how it works in yourself, then it's easier to understand how it works with other people, for other people, and be more compassionate for them instead of judging them or impatient with them or whatever. Yeah, I was thinking of this book of Pema Chodron's, The Places That Scare You. It's been a while since I read that, but I think a lot of people find that very helpful.